They dismissed Gripen as overrated until NATO pilots met it in combat exercises that exposed how networked fighters rewrite airpower assumptions. Most fighter jets earn reputations long before they earn results. The Gripen earned a reputation for being small, cheap, defensive, and limited. Analysts dismissed it as a budget compromise, not a battlefield predator. Pilots joked that taking it against heavier fighters was like showing up late, underpowered, and already defeated. That belief hardened into consensus across defense circles, procurement offices, and military media. But reputations in warfare are fragile things. They survive only until tested, and in controlled skies under watchful sensors with experienced pilots on both sides, the Gripen was tested. What followed forced NATO pilots, planners, and governments to confront an uncomfortable reality about modern air combat. This story begins with perception, not performance. On paper, the Gripen looked outmatched. A single engine against twin-engine opponents, smaller fuel reserves, a lighter weapons load, fewer hardpoints, no stealth shaping, no billion-dollar marketing ecosystem behind it. Designed by a neutral country outside NATO, with no recent wars to advertise its effectiveness. In an era obsessed with stealth, payload, and raw power, the Gripen looked like yesterday's solution. Suitable for air policing, maybe border defense, but not serious combat against peer adversaries. That assumption shaped global decisions. Countries equated capability with size, price, and prestige. Heavy fighters became symbols of deterrence. Light fighters were treated as placeholders. The Gripen fell into that category, quietly flying for nations that prioritized resilience over projection. It did not dominate headlines, it did not anchor alliance strategy. And because it did not look threatening, it was rarely examined closely. Then came NATO exercises designed to remove illusion. Exercises where radar coverage is dense, electronic warfare is active, and pilots fly under pressure that mirrors real conflict. These environments exist to expose weakness, not hide it. And when the Gripen entered those environments, something unexpected happened. It did not behave like a light fighter trying to survive. It behaved like a system designed to see first, coordinate faster, and strike before opponents understood the engagement had begun. This was not about raw speed or brute force, it was about information, about how aircraft share data, manage emissions, and multiply individual pilot skill through networking. The Gripen was not trying to overpower heavier jets, it was trying to outthink them. And in doing so, it exposed a gap between how air combat is marketed and how it is actually fought. For NATO pilots accustomed to traditional hierarchies of air power, the experience was disruptive. Engagements ended before they fully formed, targets appeared too late, situational awareness collapsed at critical moments. Instructors took notes, planners asked questions, and quietly, assumptions began to crack. The implications extended far beyond exercises, because if a smaller, cheaper aircraft could challenge established fighters under controlled conditions, then procurement logic itself was flawed. Cost did not necessarily mean weakness. Weight did not guarantee dominance, and technological sophistication was not limited to the most expensive platforms. This is why the Gripen story matters now. Not as a tale of national pride or marketing success, but as a case study in how modern warfare rewards systems over symbols. As alliances expand, budgets tighten, and strategic pressure increases in regions like the Arctic and the Baltic, choices about air power are no longer theoretical. They shape deterrence, sovereignty, and political leverage. Understanding why the Gripen was underestimated requires stepping away from myths and into mechanisms. It requires examining how pilots actually fight, how networks replace mass, and how assumptions can become liabilities. That examination begins here, before the dogfights, before the numbers, and before the political pressure that followed. Everything now depends on what comes next. To understand why the Gripen performed the way it did, you have to discard the traditional image of air combat. Modern engagements are not won by turning tighter or carrying more missiles alone. They are decided by who sees first, who understands the battle space faster, and who can act before the opponent realizes they are already inside a kill chain. The Gripen was engineered around that reality from the beginning. At the center of its design is network-centric warfare. The aircraft was built to operate as part of a distributed system rather than as an isolated platform. Each jet is a node, constantly exchanging data with other aircraft, ground sensors, and command elements. This allows the formation to function like a single organism instead of individual fighters competing for awareness. In practical terms, that means one aircraft can illuminate targets while others remain electronically silent, invisible to enemy radar, but fully informed. This approach changes everything. Traditional fighters rely heavily on their own radar emissions, which announce their presence long before missiles are fired. The Gripen minimizes that vulnerability by separating sensing from shooting. One jet takes the risk. The rest exploit the information. Against opponents trained to hunt individual radar signatures, this creates confusion and delay. By the time the enemy reacts, the engagement geometry is already unfavorable. Another overlooked factor is sortie generation. The Gripen was designed for dispersed operations. It can land on highways, refuel quickly, and return to the air with minimal ground support. Maintenance cycles are short. Turnaround times are measured in minutes, not hours. In prolonged scenarios, this translates into more aircraft available more often. Quantity of presence becomes a quality of its own. Weapons integration also plays a role. The Gripen does not depend on a single missile or sensor. It integrates a wide range of Western munitions and can update software rapidly. This flexibility allows it to adapt faster than platforms locked into rigid upgrade schedules. In exercises, adaptability matters as much as raw performance. Pilots flying the Gripen can change tactics mid-scenario without waiting for new hardware. Pilot workload is another critical variable. The cockpit was designed to reduce cognitive strain, presenting information clearly and prioritizing threats automatically. This matters in high-density environments where seconds decide outcomes. A pilot who understands the picture faster makes fewer mistakes. When multiplied across a formation, that advantage compounds. During NATO exercises, these design choices produced asymmetric effects. Heavier fighters entered engagements expecting traditional dynamics. Instead, they encountered opponents they could not easily detect, supported by a shared awareness picture that seemed to anticipate their moves. Missile shots were taken earlier, defensive reactions came later. Instructors observed that engagements ended decisively, not gradually. Importantly, these results did not rely on stealth shaping or overwhelming electronic attack. They relied on coordination. This challenges the assumption that only fifth-generation aircraft can dominate contested airspace. It suggests there are multiple paths to effectiveness, each with different trade-offs in cost, logistics, and political dependence. However, it is essential to note the limits. Exercises are controlled environments. Rules of engagement are defined. Certain capabilities are simulated. No aircraft operates under the full spectrum of wartime uncertainty. The Gripen's performance does not invalidate heavier platforms or stealth fighters. What it does is expose the danger of linear thinking in procurement and doctrine. The real lesson is not that the Gripen is superior in all scenarios. The lesson is that systems designed for resilience, networking, and rapid adaptation can punch above their weight. When analysts dismiss the aircraft based on size and price, they miss the architecture beneath the airframe. And it was that architecture, not the engine count, that reshaped expectations. This technical reality sets the stage for what followed, because once these dynamics were observed, the conversation shifted. From whether the Gripen could survive, to whether it could change how alliances think about air power itself. Once the exercises ended, the results did not stay confined to briefing rooms. They triggered quiet reassessments inside air forces that preferred not to challenge established hierarchies publicly. For smaller nations operating within alliances, the implications were particularly sensitive. If effectiveness no longer scaled cleanly with cost and size, then dependency on a single supplier or doctrine became a strategic risk rather than a guarantee of security. This is where the Gripen story intersects with geopolitics, because air power is never just about aircraft. It is about access, control, and leverage. Who owns the software? Who controls the upgrades? Who decides when parts are delivered or withheld? Modern fighters are not just weapons. They are political instruments embedded inside supply chains, licensing agreements, and alliance expectations. For decades, NATO air power has been structured around interoperability managed from the top down. Shared systems, shared doctrine, shared logistics. That model creates cohesion, but it also creates dependency. Smaller allies rely on larger partners for sustainment and modernization. In peacetime, this is manageable. In crisis, it becomes a pressure point. The Gripen challenges that structure by design. It was built for a country that assumed it might have to fight alone. That assumption shaped everything from maintenance philosophy to software control. Unlike platforms that require foreign approval for modifications, the Gripen allows operators a higher degree of autonomy. That autonomy is not dramatic on the flight line. It becomes decisive during political friction. This is why discussions around the aircraft quickly moved beyond performance. They entered the realm of sovereignty. When nations evaluated their future fleets, they were no longer asking only how jets perform in combat. They were asking who controls their air force in a crisis. These questions intensified as security conditions changed in Europe's north and east. Increased air policing missions, frequent intercepts, and persistent gray zone activity placed stress on readiness and budgets. Aircraft that could fly more often, integrate quickly, and operate independently gained quiet appeal. Not as replacements for high-end platforms, but as complements that filled gaps without creating new vulnerabilities. At the same time, defense industries entered the conversation. Fighter programs are economic engines. They generate skilled labor, technology transfer, and long-term industrial capacity. For countries that had lost domestic aerospace capabilities, the idea of rebuilding them carried political weight. It spoke to resilience beyond the battlefield. But these opportunities also created friction. Choosing one platform over another is never neutral. It sends signals to allies, to suppliers, to adversaries. When governments explored alternatives, they faced warnings framed as technical concerns but rooted in politics, interoperability risks, alliance cohesion, strategic alignment. These arguments were not without merit. Operating multiple platforms does increase complexity. Training pipelines multiply, logistics networks expand, yet complexity is not the same as vulnerability, and uniformity is not the same as resilience. History shows that overconcentration creates single points of failure. In modern warfare, diversity of capability can be a hedge against disruption, especially when that diversity is built on shared standards rather than shared control. The Gripen debate exposed this tension. It forced planners to articulate what they valued more: absolute integration or controlled independence, maximum capability or sustained availability, symbolic deterrence or practical readiness. Behind these debates, intelligence assessments quietly evolved. Analysts tracked sortie rates, mission availability, and integration speed during real-world deployments. They noted how quickly Gripen units adapted to alliance command structures without lengthy transition periods. They observed how pilots trained on different systems coordinated effectively when data flowed freely. None of this proved that one aircraft was the answer. What it proved was that the problem had been framed too narrowly. Air power was no longer just about penetrating contested airspace. It was about sustaining pressure over time under political constraint without losing operational freedom. As these insights accumulated, the stakes rose, because decisions made in procurement offices would shape not just fleets, but freedom of action for decades. And the question shifted from whether the Gripen could fight to whether alliances were ready to accept what its success implied. The final phase of this story is not about a single aircraft. It is about what modern air power reveals when tested under pressure, stripped of marketing and hierarchy. The Gripen's performance did not overturn decades of doctrine overnight, but it forced a recalculation. It showed that dominance is no longer reserved for the largest platform or the deepest budget. It belongs to systems that can adapt, endure, and remain politically usable when circumstances tighten. For global security, this matters because future conflict is unlikely to begin with total war. It will start in gray zones, persistent intercepts, electronic probing, airspace violations that stop just short of escalation. In those environments, availability matters more than spectacle. Aircraft that can fly often, integrate quickly, and operate without external permission shape the balance day after day. Deterrence becomes cumulative, not theatrical. This reality reshapes alliance dynamics. Coalitions function best when members contribute reliably, not symbolically. An aircraft grounded by logistics, cost, or political restriction contributes nothing, regardless of its theoretical capability. By contrast, a platform that flies daily, shares data seamlessly, and sustains pilot proficiency exerts continuous influence. That influence is quiet, but it compounds. For policymakers, the lesson is uncomfortable. Procurement choices are often framed as statements of loyalty or prestige, but warfare is indifferent to symbolism. It rewards preparation and punishes assumption. The Gripen debate exposed how easily decision-makers conflate alliance alignment with operational effectiveness. They are related, but not identical. Looking ahead, the same tension will appear across domains. Naval power, cyber capability, space resilience. Everywhere, states will face choices between tightly controlled high-end systems and more flexible architectures that trade peak performance for autonomy and endurance. The question will not be which system is best in isolation, but which system remains usable under political strain. Adversaries are watching closely. They study not only aircraft, but debates. They learn where pressure works, where dependencies exist, where supply chains can be influenced. When nations hesitate to exercise autonomy, it signals leverage. When they diversify capability intelligently, it complicates coercion. Air power, in this sense, becomes a language spoken beyond combat. This is why the Gripen story persists. Not because it is perfect, but because it exposes a pattern. Underestimation rooted in outdated metrics, surprise generated by integration rather than mass. Effectiveness achieved through design choices aligned with reality, not image. For pilots, the takeaway is simpler. Situational awareness wins fights. Training matters. Systems that reduce cognitive load and amplify teamwork save lives. None of these truths are revolutionary. What changed is which platforms embody them most consistently. For alliances, the message is sharper. Unity does not require uniformity. Interoperability does not require dependence. Strength does not demand singularity. In an era defined by uncertainty, resilience emerges from options, not absolutes. As pressure increases in contested regions, from the Arctic to the Baltic and beyond, air power will remain one of the first instruments tested. How often jets fly, how quickly they adapt, how freely they operate. These factors will shape deterrence long before missiles are launched. The Gripen did not rewrite the rules of air combat. It reminded observers of rules they had forgotten. That information moves faster than force. That systems outperform platforms. And that in modern warfare, the most dangerous assumption is believing reputation alone decides outcomes. In the end, air power choices reveal national priorities. Flexibility, sovereignty, and readiness cannot be improvised once crises begin. They must be designed, funded, and accepted long before conflict tests them. That is the quiet warning embedded in this case, waiting for leaders willing to listen before history repeats itself again under harsher conditions later. Gripen's story isn't about hype or patriotism, it's about how modern air power actually works under pressure. If this analysis sharpened your view, like, subscribe, and share the northern frame. Comment what capability matters most today: cost, sovereignty, or dominance. The next conflict won't forgive assumptions made by real-world decisions alone.